Good morning. You've now been exposed to economists for a few days. I thought I should just, make a sobering comment because there are risks associated with being exposed to economists. It's not exactly as dangerous as radiation, but it could actually be something that one just has to be aware of. Now, they tell the story of the two people in one of these balloons with the burner underneath that you float peacefully across the countryside. So these two people were up in this balloon, and at some point they...
We'll deal with that later. So I think it comes on again when you start using it.
Well, I think it's probably this. At some point they realized they were totally lost. So they were looking for help, and they saw someone down on the countryside walking, and they lowered the balloon to within shouting range, and they shouted to them, "Can you tell us where we are?" And this chap looked up and he said, "Well, you're in a balloon." So the one chap tells his mate, "That person must be an economist." He said, "Why do you say that?" "Because the answer is right, but it doesn't help at all." Now, coming to think of this, it occurred to me that the indicator game can be pretty much like that. It can tell you a lot of things about many things, but it may not help you at all. I think this is attributed to an economist by the name of Frank Kahn, who said that if you can quantify everything that you are talking about, your knowledge is of a limited and meager kind. If you can't quantify what you are talking about, your knowledge is still of a meager and limited kind. So whether you measure or do not measure, on both sides you are vulnerable about understanding, what is going on. My bias, which I can declare at the outset, is for, there's an English saying that says the more the merrier. But I think when you get to indicators, my preference is for the less the better. And I hope I can try and explain something about that. So Faz mentioned that I was at one point responsible for financial management in the university. And part of my portfolio was also strategic planning. So there was a chap in our university who was a statistician by training, and he was excellent at collecting and distributing information. And he was particularly knowledgeable about education. At one point, he also worked in the department of which was then national education. So I said to him, now, we were asked to come up with some measurements of performance within the university. So I said to him, now, what do we measure? Your database, what's available in the form of measurement in university? And he said, well, I've got about 160 indicators. Which do you need? And my immediate response was too much, overload. You can't manage 160 indicators. You can't account for performing according to 160 indicators. We eventually ended up with 12 for the university as key performance indicators. And I would like to make a distinction later on, which I'll show you, between key performance indicators, and indicators. I'll come back to that. So what do I try to aim for in this session? Hopefully when you, and my study material is basically the slides and one piece that I've asked to be distributed, which is actually a piece of background to the whole topic. So hopefully I can, through the slides which I will show you, succeed in achieving a few outcomes. Firstly, to explain the prerequisites for performance indicators in order for them to be useful as management tools. So I'm going to take a much more practical view of you sit in an organization, whether it's national government province, wherever, and you know the whole world around you engulfs you in measurement and indicators. How do you actually survive, and what do you actually use that will really improve your efficiency as a manager? We're going to look at the hierarchy and the internal consistency of performance indicators. I would also like to distinguish between different types, and you will find, as Safas also suggested, some clear overlap between what I'm doing and what Mr. Barberton showed you. But there may also be different perspectives here and there. I'm going to come back to the point about how many. Something I think which is very important is the question of ownership of indicators. Who is in charge and who is committed to the indicators that are expected of managers to be performing on? Then a few points about the links between managing indicators or goals and risk management. What's the rationale for and the practical implications of a functional link between indicators and performance contracts? Then I'm going to look a bit at auditing as well. I'm sure you know all of this, but you know there's a huge thing in government about auditing performance indicators and so-called predetermined objectives. How does that fit into the picture? And then finally a few words which I think touches on things that Safas understood we also have dealt with you earlier, and that is, you know, what are the unintended consequences of, if I can coin a phrase, managing by indicators. I'm going to start off with just one or two pieces of context. Firstly, a context from literature on economics and growth, and then a global context, which I think provides a nice background for us for the focus on indicators in a managerial position in a particular institutional setting. This is just an interesting quote coming from a working paper by Lindsay Whitfield that was published under the auspices of the Danish Institute of International Studies, and I'd like to read this to you. There seems to be broad consensus among researchers that the amount of human capital the poor possess is decisive for the extent to which economic growth is pro-poor. In fact, there's empirical evidence that shows that where economic growth actually changes the income distribution of a country, it is through human capital, the buildup of human capital. Human capital, this is nothing new to any of us, is normally referred to as education, skills training, and good health, and is essential for the poor to take advantage of economic opportunities. This is a context, I think, very broadly defined, within which the service of education is rendered in any country. I also want to point out the global context. In Washington, there's an NGO called the International Budget Project. It's been running for a few years. I was once involved in adjudicating their assessment of budget transparency in South Africa. And they do this amongst a number of countries all over the world. The purpose of this is to try and find out which countries are better than others in accessing information on budget matters to the poor of a country. The whole idea being, does the budget actually empower people? And they need to understand also what's in the budget, the underlying idea behind this. So this is the partnership which they are forging with countries across the globe with a view to collaborate with civil society to use budget analysis and advocacy as a tool to improve effective governance and to reduce poverty. If you're interested, you'll get a handout of the slides. You can also go to their website and find out more about what they're doing. So they've been ranking countries, talking about indicators. They've got a long, long list of questions which researchers in different countries then investigate their budget processes. It's about information with what is in the budget. It's about the administrative process of the budget. It's about the parliamentary process of the budget. It's about legislation. It's a huge range of things that they are actually assessing to get an answer. And then they also reduce that to the single index, which we heard, sometimes hides more than it discloses. But they also then give a ranking for countries. And this is what the latest ranking looks like. And this is 2010. This is not the first time that South Africa was on top of the ranking. The previous year, France was on top. The year before that, it was also South Africa, if I remember correctly. And of course, as one would expect, this normally gets also mentioned by the finance minister in his budget speech, which we should grant him. So, and what you see is that South Africa tops a number of developed countries and also a number of emerging market economies. And you will see South Africa is now a member of BRIC. Actually, it's now BRICSA. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And we top China, you see, lies at number 13. And Brazil at number 71. Russia at number 60, I don't know where India is. But clearly, South Africa is in a very good position there. And it is about information. It is about information and whether people can actually access that information easily and whether the information is reliable. And that is what indicators are about. So the very recent thing which I got from the website less than 2 weeks ago is that they are now trying to persuade governments across the world to actually enter into some other accord about budget transparency. Now you may know how these international agreements, they've got a language of their own. They would start off by saying, having this and this, seeing this and this, convinced that this and this is so. We believe that this is this, and therefore we commit ourselves to this and this, and we follow the following principles. Now this document is exactly the same. And that's a document that was actually that you would get a copy of. So it starts off by saying, if governments now sign this, governments will actually be saying to each other and actually agreeing with each other about the following. Firstly, recognizing that fiscal policies and all the components of policies, fiscal policies, including managing public resources, which is what happens in each government department, recognizing that fiscal policies have critical impacts on economic, social, and environmental outcomes in all countries at all levels of development. And those dots stand for blah, blah, blah. There are more. I just took out a few things. Believing that access to high-quality information, meaningful public participation, and effective accountability, and the mechanisms for that, blah, 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 increases the legitimacy of and trust in government, which is part of the process of developing a democracy. And we are in the early stages of actually developing a democracy. We're only now busy with that for 18 years. A few countries in the world have had much longer experience with that, so we must realize that we are still learning by doing, but this is part of it. Increase the willingness to pay taxes. Nobody is, of course, willing to pay taxes, but nonetheless. And provide financing. Strengthen the efficiency, equity, effectiveness, stability, and sustainability of fiscal policies, and enhance the likelihood that these policies have positive economic, social, and environmental impacts. So, believing this, a number of other things, we therefore declare a number of high-level principles to guide policymakers and all other stakeholders in fiscal policy in their efforts to improve what? Fiscal transparency, participation, and accountability, and to help promote improvements in the coverage, consistency, coherence of the existing standards and norms for fiscal transparency. So the next slide now highlights a few of the principles to which countries will be expected to commit themselves. And the one principle that I just want to highlight for purposes of this discussion is the access to fiscal information. So what does it say? It says that the public should be presented with high quality financial and non-financial information on past, present, and forecast fiscal activities, performance, fiscal risks, public assets, public liabilities. The presentation of fiscal information in budgets, fiscal reports, financial statements, national accounts, that's for the economists, what they do sometimes, like in the Reserve Bank, and then central statistical services, should be an obligation of government, meet internationally recognized standards, and should be consistent across the different types of reports. Assurances are required, and this is the important point, of the integrity of fiscal data and information. We'll come back to this point. Then government should communicate the objectives they are pursuing and the outputs they are producing with the resources entrusted to them, and endeavor to assess and disclose the anticipated and actual social, economic, and environmental outcomes. Many of these ideas and ideals are also captured in the Public Finance Management Act of 1999, which to a large extent governs a lot of the reporting and the financial discipline in government. So South Africa has actually been committed to this for a long time. It should not be difficult for the government, I think, for instance, to sign this, because I think that is what the government has been doing. It would be easier for the government to sign this being not at a ranking of 92 than China with a ranking of 70, because clearly there's some work to be done there if you just look at those comparisons on basis of the ranking levels. So let's just formalize in a sense, what the situation is within any organization against the backdrop of these two contexts that I just gave. Firstly, all organizations have a planning process, an implementation process, and the monitoring and the control process. You can probably classify work in many different ways, but for the purpose of our discussion, I think this is useful. So let's just look a bit at this and see, how we actually fit the whole issue of management by indicators into this picture. So all departments do this nowadays. In a sense, it's almost also prescribed for them to do so. You have strategic goals. If you look at the annual reports of education departments across the country, you will find that they actually disclose their strategic goals and how they're going to achieve that. What is important there, and we'll come back to that again later on, is that the thing that can play havoc with your ability to achieve strategic goals is risk. And it might be the role of the manager in all different positions within an organization. All managers have the responsibility to mitigate or actually eliminate risk. The more successful a manager is to do that, the better the chance that the people reporting to that manager will be empowered to actually achieve the goals. But if that's not the case, you may not actually achieve your goals. So the strategic goals of an organization is overarching, and that actually sets the scene for all subsequent or derived goals, which I show there in the next block. And that would be for if the department has 2 or 3 DDGs, each of those would be managing a particular division. Next level, chief director, directorate, so throughout the organization. All the different positions of managers, but they are derived or have to support the overarching strategic goals. And you can take that further also to the districts and to even school levels. So ideally one looks at an integrated set of goals that add up to the total or the overarching goals, or that support the overarching goals. So how do you actually go about in the process of implementation? Well, this is where performance indicators now come in. So you would have performance indicators linked to the strategic goals, basically emphasizing the importance of converting resources into results. And then you would have mutually consistent key performance indicators for each managerial sphere in service of those goals. And the part in italics there, again emphasizing the importance that risk mitigation creates or even improve the scope for effective achievement of the key performance indicators. This is the operational side. This is the day-to-day functioning linked to indicators. Then there's the monitor and control part of managerial responsibility. Because you have to check. As a manager, you need to check all the time. You need to ensure that you are on track. You can't start doing that on the day at the end of the quarter or the year where you have to report. Obviously, that would be too late. But you would need in-time information. And I know a little bit about the information in the education field. There's a lot of information, a lot of data being collected. But it has to be reliable and it has to be in time. Very often in-time information. Now, achievements like passing matric, you only get that result once a year. Teacher absenteeism, you can presumably get once a day if you need it. So there's some data lend themselves to more regular control and monitoring and some not. But what is important, the feedback that you get is not only with a view to determine whether you are on track, but also to assess whether your indicators or goals are still relevant, because you may need to change them. Now, in the system that Mr. Barberton presumably explained to you, and which I'm sure you know already as well, once you've committed yourselves to predetermined objectives, you can't easily change that midstream, which has a good and a bad side. Because the good side is, why you can't change it, is that you should not be able to change a goal easily, because that will enable you to change the goal if you were not good at achieving it, which is not what we want. Then you can actually hide your poor performance. But if you can change a goal because the external environment or the whole context has changed substantially, then you should be able to do that. Otherwise it becomes inflexible and it loses its meaning. Then there's the question of public accountability, to which we will return at the end. And we will also distinguish there between the ex ante and the ex post facto judgment about effectiveness. So, in a sense, we're going to talk about this a bit later on, is the question about performance contracts and to what extent should performance contracts actually be an important, well, let me put it this way, to what extent should indicators form part of the performance contract? How should it be captured in the performance contract? What kind of incentives should be in support of that? And also what kind of sanctions do we need only carrots or carrots and sticks? And how are they accounted for in performance contracts? So this basically sets the operational scene, I think, in which all of us find ourselves in a managerial position. Okay, so against this backdrop, let's get down to the more detailed discussion. Firstly, about prerequisites for indicators to be effective management tools. Now, I did see in the document that underlined the presentation by Mr. Barberton that there was a lot of discussion about this as well, so I can probably go over this a bit quicker, but just emphasize a few things. This is not a list, that comes formally from a government document, but kind of list from what I experienced to be important considerations, having had this kind of responsibility a few times in my life about, when do they actually help you in fulfilling your managerial task. First point we've already discussed, they should be in service of the overarching strategic goals. In fact, at each next tier of management, the test should always be, does that serve the previous or the higher tier of management's goals? That should be the way in which all goals and indicators are connected and the internal consistency are ensured by asking that question. What, if any, contribution does my goal or my set of goals make to the achievement of the goals to the person to whom I report? And they should be mutually consistent, which means you cannot send out a circular, head of government department, the DG can't send out a circular and say, well, chaps, we've heard about this thing about the PFMA and the Auditor General is blowing in my neck. We need to actually get a list of strategic goals. Please formulate yours and send it to me, and I'll send it through to the AG, or if you're on a provincial government department, send that to the Department of Basic Education. So that's how we will be reporting on. That won't work. And I'm sure you know that. It has to be developed interactively in order to ensure that they actually support each other. So it can't be a set of independent goals. They have to be consistent. They have to be in both the design and the revision. There has to be collaboration throughout the organization. Then it's about the quantification. Yes, they have to be quantifiable, but as I said with the quote from Frank Kahn in the beginning, it doesn't mean to say that if you can quantify everything that you've solved all the problems or that you understand everything. So you have to have some leeway there as well. They have to be realistic. You don't impress with the indicator, you impress with the performance. So the indicator has to be realistic. Now, of course, this is one of the things, you can set yourself up for success by going in very low, or you can set yourself up for failure by going into high. It has to be responsive to changed circumstances. I mean, if there's a sudden huge cut in the budget of education department, it's an external factor that has changed. You can't keep on beating the same drum. You have to actually have a way of determining indicators which can be adjusted depending on external circumstances. I don't say that sometimes cutting a budget is good for enhancing productivity. So again, you have to be balanced there. Sometimes the cutting of the budget should not actually lead to a reduction or a lower level of indicators. Sometimes the cutting the budget is good for the pressure under which all of, if you're not under pressure, you don't have to make choices. If everything is possible, you never need to make choices.